Starship is the next big one.
The last time somebody tried to build a rocket with this many engines on it was the Russians during the Apollo era.
Okay.
And they never got a vehicle in orbit. It blew up every single time.
Most interesting places on Earth are going to have something looking down at it almost continuously. Oftentimes we see the technology before the government does. And we see its development. We understand what is going on, when it's likely to go to market.
What's going on, Stephen and Michael? So happy to have you here. We are with the founders of Starbridge Capital.
Great to be here.
We're good.
Yeah.
Listen, this is the first time we have somebody, two gentlemen on the podcast covering the industry of space, space explorations, colonization, tools in space, and we'll cover all of that. And it's very interesting to me because, I think every generation has their space moment, so to say. If you go 3 generations back, it was actually just the airplane, the Wright brothers. 1 generation ago was, the first human stepping foot on the moon, which we'll talk about later maybe briefly. And of course, the younger generation having Elon Musk bring back space, because I remember being in high school and the manned space programs were getting canceled. It looked like we were not going back. And one of my memories about space was I was in elementary school in my geography class, and I told my professor, I saw a documentary, we're going to Mars in my lifetime. And he told me, it's never going to happen. It's going to be not in the generation of your grandkids. And yet here we are. Not only do we have, people like Elon Musk with SpaceX, going to space, but even there's an entire industry, which I'm so looking forward to today's session, where, I'm a dabbler. I've invested with you and a couple others, and really want to break down the space thesis with you of, where is it, where has it gone, and where's it kind of going next. So thanks so much for being here.
So much going on, it took 2 of us.
Yes.
To explain it.
And so before we get into the really nitty gritty, I would love to learn from you kind of, why did you get into space? And also, why did you start? What's the opportunity you saw? And where do you say, hey, there's this current path of life you're on where you say, hey, there's something bigger out there? And also, what does it kind of mean to you? Maybe we'll start with you, Stephen.
Sure. So I've always been kind of a science geek. I straight A student, all that goody stuff all the way through school. Graduated with a bacteriology degree and then promptly went into finance. So science was always my background, but I also wanted to make money. I started looking at the space sector around 2004, I think, when the X Prize was announced. And I was very interested in watching that because it was the first time I'd ever heard of a commercial company doing something in space. And I grew up a Star Wars fan and sci-fi and all that stuff. But this is the first time it actually connected to my work. Yeah. And I was trading, I was a portfolio manager of a hedge fund down here in Florida at that point in time, I believe. Maybe it was a little bit earlier. And so when I saw one company on the stock index who was a commercial space company, it was a little company called Space Dev. And they were developing rocket engines, hybrid rocket engines, that were going to go in this crazy little space plane that then they had this whole 20-year plan of how they were going to develop commercial space. And I didn't know if it was real or not, but I started listening in on their quarterly conference calls and just kind of really getting into what their vision was, because it's just really cool. Yeah. And that company eventually got bought out by Sierra Space. Now I'm jumping forward a little bit. That is Dream Chaser. That company's original technology is what you're now seeing out of Sierra Space. That's going to be launching. I don't remember what their timetable is, but it's one of the first space planes that you're going to see, and it is funded and it is contracted and it's going to be happening.
Space planes, as in the spaceships we know from them, going to space.
It launches vertically on the top of a traditional rocket, and then it is a glide back like the shuttle. So it is one of the.
And is that for practical purposes or more like tourism?
Both. So they have a cargo and they have an astronaut version of it.
Okay.
But yeah,
but back to your story, note. Right?
Yes. So 2004, I started dabbling in it a little bit. There wasn't much commercial, as I was saying. It wasn't until about 2011, when my wife was pregnant with our first child. And I started, thinking hedge funds, what am I doing? What am I adding?
Yeah.
Where is this all going? And you just get philosophical, I guess,
Sure.
when you start having your first kids. And I finally decided I had to get off the fence and actually see if there was something there.
Yeah.
And so I started going to space conferences, started meeting people kind of on my own time, really trying to see if there was a commercial angle in this that I could revert back into what I was already doing. And so I followed that for several more years. I did a few angel investments here and there. But it wasn't until 2017 that I felt, I was seeing enough commercial deal flow, early stage companies where the business case actually closed, because I did a lot of investment analysis as my day job.
Yeah.
And, I was looking for that point where my profession and my passion were able to converge. And that happened in 2017. I saw how I could construct a viable portfolio like I was doing in all my other work and get investors an outsized return from it. And it was, Michael can rattle off, I'm sure, 100 reasons why that was. And I saw some of them and he saw some of them, but we met in 2017 and have been running since.
So was it the business opportunity that drew you to space, or was there something, some people grew up saying like, one day I want Elon Musk has the famous quote saying he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact.
Yes.
Like, is this something where you say like, I actually want to one time in my life live in space?
So I'm very practical when it comes to this. It was my passion, but I didn't activate my passion until I saw the business.
Got it.
That was still there. So this is something I plan to do for the rest of my life, but I had to wait until the opportunity and the market was there. I didn't think I could build it.
Yeah.
I think as Starbridge grows, we'll have more influence in actually helping to shape it.
Yeah.
But, we're not driving it. This is something that has come together naturally and due to decades and decades of research and development. And, we're essentially trend followers.
Right.
With one little pinky on the wheel, maybe.
Right. And we'll cover a lot of that too, because, I think there's been an interesting, regime change over the last few decades where everything was purely public sector driven originally. And now it's slowly then it became billionaire driven for a while. And, as the cost of space is kind of going down, it's becoming more and more of an industry where you as a normal individual, you might actually start being able to have influence.
Absolutely.
Whether that's as a founder or as an allocator, which it was virtually impossible unless the famous joke is how to become a millionaire. You start with $1 billion and then invest in space.
It's really opened up.
It's still somewhat the case from time to time.
But how about you, Michael? What drew you to space, and what made you get started in this industry?
I actually sort of gave up on space as a young kid. I flew model rockets as a kid. I was like 12, 13 years old. But I was never the best in school. And so I back then, if you...
So we get the school geek and the not so good in school.
Totally.
Right. Well, I could do it if I wanted to. It just didn't entertain me or didn't challenge me or wasn't interesting. And so I looked at the requirements for what it would take to get to NASA, and like either a Navy fighter pilot or a PhD. I'm like, just not for me. So I went another direction.
Yep.
And that direction was into the internet because I graduated high school, and then right about that time, really got plugged into the internet about the time late '89, early '90, pre-web. If anybody remembers Gopher, that was what was around. I actually wrote a little bit of that, and spent the next 13 years doing that. Had one of the first 12 web servers in the world running for Georgia Tech at the time when I worked for them, that kind of thing. And right around about 2 years after the bubble popped, 2001, that happened, actually had a heart attack early. I was 33 years old, kind of young. And laying on the hospital bed, I said, okay, if I'm ever going to do anything interesting in my life, I better get off my ass and actually do something about it. And even though all the stuff I did on the internet was quite interesting and fun, I really wanted to go beyond that. So that's when I tried my first startup, completely screwed it up, did all the mistakes that I now tell people not to do because I did them. But what I was noticing, and this comes from reading a lot of like Clayton Christensen, innovation theory, technology diffusion, how it happens. What I noticed was out in the Black Rock Desert, there were a bunch of people flying rockets, hobby rockets, but they were getting very large. They were starting to do the things that even 10, 15 years earlier, only a government could do. And I saw the same trend that the internet had done to democratizing information technology. I looked at the space, the hobby space sector, and I saw the same trend. I'm like, okay, this is going to go the same route. This is something I can get behind because it's going to be just as transformational as the internet was. And it's like, it's a fairly unique position in your life to be able to be involved in two radical changes to the human experience across the globe. And when I pivoted away from the internet and started basically did a lot of blogging about the fact there were a lot of people talking about doing business in space who had never actually done business. Had no idea what the time value of money was or anything like that. And
a lot of like futurists and visionaries.
Yes, a lot of people
like
selling a dream.
Right.
Very
if
engineered.
somebody just gives me $3 billion, I'll go build a space station. Like, okay. So I was talking about that, and I had some friends call me up and called me out on it and said, I'm building a launch company. I need a CFO, and I need someone to do sales. That was when I joined a company called Mastin Space Systems, which was doing vertical takeoff, vertical landing before Elon even started doing it. And there was a lot of synergy at the time, but a whole bunch of companies were trying this stuff out, and we had no idea what we were doing. Did that for a while, really got embedded in the sector. And some of this goes back to some of the things that we did. Specifically, there was a law passed in 2004, right after the X Prize flight, that it made it legal for commercial companies to actually fly into space without having to have a government contract.
Right.
That law really opened up. That's the law that allowed Elon to launch a Falcon 1. And that was one of the real transformational moments in being there and doing that. 2008 financial crisis came around, went back and did a few internet things, built a mobile technology consultancy startup, but always was watching what was going on in the sector. And I ended up at just a generic technology venture fund in Atlanta at the time. And I saw, what I saw at the time was larger venture capital funds were starting to dabble in the sector. And they really didn't have the core understanding of what works, what doesn't, what businesses are real, which ones aren't. And this goes all the way up to Sequoia, some of their decisions at the time for what to invest in. Big firms making those mistakes. But at the same time, and this is something that Stephen and I talked about when we got together in 2017, was bad decisions, but also companies that we knew were real companies and actually had real businesses couldn't find that funding because those big traditional investors couldn't understand it. And that's when we sort of decided it's time for a sector specific made of professional money managers, Stephen, and people who understand the business of running a company in the sector. That combined was necessary to be able to get real traditional finance to be able to rationally engage with the emerging space sector. And that's where that started to take off in 2017.
Awesome. And I have a whole line of questions regarding profitability versus futurism down the line. But maybe before we get into the kind of the business side of things, I want to take a more an eagle eye look over the space sector, because we know if somebody asks me how would you conceptualize metaverse, I can give it a pretty nitty gritty breakdown, like what are the different subsegments, So I want to do the same thing with you guys. Kind of what's the space thesis? Because, there's so many different things floating around. Most people probably think of tourism, maybe something of exploration, maybe of like asteroid mining, maybe of like colonization. And then, of course, there's more surface level things like, hey, better satellite technology, things that actually help Earth, right? And then as we were standing out on the balcony, tell me all crazy things like, how you can use it for medicine and genetics. So if you had to kind of conceptually break it down, what are maybe these buckets that that make up the space industry? On high level,
So it changes so much over time. It depends upon what frame you're looking at. If you're looking at in the past, it was almost all government, almost all geosynchronous satellites with communications. In the last 10 years, it has changed so much. And if you're going out another 10 years, it's one of the most rapidly changing industries. So right now, if you're looking at it from our perspective.
So maybe the framing then would be,
yep.
What is it made up of today? Meaning what's there today?
Yep.
And maybe the next 10 years.
Yep. So it's going to change a lot, as I said. Right now, all the focus has come to low Earth orbit.
Yep.
So everything that you're seeing launched on SpaceX rockets, almost everything is going to low Earth orbit. You're seeing a rapid deployment of new satellites. 5 years ago, I think we had maybe 1,800, 2,000 satellites active in orbit. I think SpaceX can do that in a couple of years' time at this point.
There was a statistic I saw the other day that in 1 year, SpaceX launched more satellites than in the first 52 years of the entire space program.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's crazy. So
and I mean, it was just a quick side note. I see because I've been to the SpaceX headquarters. One of my LPs invited me over there. Shout out Ashlyn, and we saw like this. It's like a factory. I mean, it's really like literally from the beginning of the building to the end of the building. At the beginning of the building, they build the first few parts. That every little piece coming together. They have these scanners to make sure there's not a single hole in it, and as you get progressed to the very end, they almost like piled up the rockets ready to go to space.
Yep.
And so they've turned something that's like, build one rocket at a time into essentially a factory of them.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a race going on now to see how many satellites the companies can get up fast enough before, I don't know, regulation catches up and
it gets too crowded.
It becomes too crowded, and you have to have a better regime for how you're assigning orbital slots and all this kind of stuff. I mean, there is a very intricate regime in place, but we're talking something like 50 to 100,000 active satellites within the next few years.
Wow.
Up there. So yeah, some of our people living on the West Coast sometimes get a pretty good view of Starlink going in a row across the sky.
And what's the purpose of having 50 to 100,000? Do they all serve? Is
coverage.
It just coverage?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you're dealing with low Earth orbit, in GEO, you have one satellite above a point, like almost like a fixed point on the Earth. And so it's in constant communication. In LEO, these things are traveling like 17.5 miles per hour. Miles per hour? Miles per second? Okay. I have to check with my technical guy once in a while here. And so you only get coverage over a spot for a brief period of time, and then it's got to swap to another satellite. So to have constant coverage, you have to have a constellation of satellites that cover that area. And then to cover all the areas simultaneously, you have to have this massive swarm. It almost looks like a living being circling the planet.
And so does let's say like AT&T then own the satellite, or like they leasing along with Verizon and everybody else? Like, are multiple companies using the same satellite, or is it that each company has their own, which is why there's so many of them?
That was the model previously, where the communication satellites were in geosync.
Yeah.
And that was where Boeing would build a satellite, and then communications companies would lease parts of it for the signal. When you get down into these LEO communications constellations like Starlink, OneWeb, those are run by one company, and they provide that connectivity through their service. So when you get a subscription to Starlink, which Steven now has one, which actually gives him some of the best connectivity he's ever had in rural Wisconsin.
Finally.
You can sometimes see there's a brief blip in connectivity as one satellite that's passed overhead hands it off to the next satellite as it come overhead. You can actually go out to the beach where it's darkening right after dusk and just look up, and you'll see the skies now full of Starlink satellites, and you'll see them faintly flying over. And what's happening is the same technology we use for cell phones, where when the phone is moving, you're switching from tower to tower to tower. Now you're just inverting that. The towers are flying overhead, and the phone is stationary. It's the same thing. And so that's that switching that occurs. And so, they're owned by one company, and they provide a service. And that service gets used by all kinds of different applications.
Super interesting, because initially I thought like, wow, if you're going to have 50,000 to 100,000 satellites swarming around Earth, at some point they're going to plug out the sunlight. Also, like if you're going to try, it's like, shoot up a rocket, you've got to make sure not to hit one. But at the scale of the Earth, 100,000 is still pretty small, like there's going to be miles and miles between each and every one of them.
It's not crowded.
Yeah, it's not crowded.
No,
not just
not
yet. We
yet.
need a couple more for that.
It's not crowded until something goes where it's not supposed to.
Yeah.
And that's when we have
It could get crowded real quick if you have a dramatic deassembly of some satellite hitting another satellite.
Sure.
And then hitting that
A lot of
orbital
space junk everywhere.
Well, but even then, it only affects usually one orbital plane.
Yeah.
And in low Earth orbit, people don't understand this, but it's a self-cleaning orbit.
Oh.
These things are constantly getting a little bit of Earth's atmosphere hitting them.
Which erodes them.
It slows them down little bit by little bit.
Yeah.
They eventually fall out of the sky until they just go
Great. So we
the-
got
into the
satellites
drink,
falling on our
usually.
heads.
well,
they
they're going so
burn up.
fast they burn up.
Nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they're designed to burn up.
I want to loop it back to the original question, which was the space thesis, right? So, because we start with that. So currently the focus is really on, you said, like satellite technologies. Any other subsegments?
About half our portfolio is satellites and true space hardware type, where we're finding, a lot of value still. Earth observation is another big growth area right now in
Like
that.
Umbra.
Like Umbra, hyperspectral satellites. We're even looking at some real-time video from space satellites. It's a lot of demand in military and in industry, even in tracking climate change and all of the things that are changing on the Earth. That's what they excel at, is change detection.
So all that's both, I guess, today and the next 10 years. I know there's some things in the portfolio, whether it's explore or off-worlds,
Yep.
which is more, for those that don't know, it's like, whether it's space exploration or whether it's space, I guess, colonization, like, starting to, like, get materials from there. How far is that out? I think, because I think when people think space, they really think that. They think, we're going to become a spacefaring civilization, multiplanetary.
Yep.
And
I applaud their vision, but that's not where we are right now.
Okay.
No,
when are we there?
Well, as a fund, we have to invest in our 10-year time windows.
Okay, sure.
So whatever we invest in, we think we are going to get an exit within, we say 10 years, but we have to put it into the 5 to 7 year bucket. And then if it takes 10, sometimes it takes 10, everything takes longer than you expect it to. So
then,
some of those far off ideas are outside of our investment window, but what we're investing in related to them now is their precursors.
Yep.
So if you like space mining, what we're investing in now is the companies that are making fully autonomous mining vehicles, mining robots, essentially, to work on Earth. Perfect it here, make money here. Maybe we get an exit. Maybe they get a spin-off, something where we get our money back to our investors with a good return. And in the process, you have developed the technology that is necessary for lunar mining, asteroid mining, all these things in the future that are outside that 10-year window. But some you have to build those technologies up. You don't just start a space mining company and expect it to be profitable.
So then maybe paint the picture. So
years.
like today's date, I think most people are somewhat aware of, okay, so it's satellites, it's SpaceX, it's like first types of space tourism. What does the space sector look like 10 years from now? Like, how does it affect people's lives? Maybe like, what does the average consumer see of all these things?
I think one of the things to kind of step back a little bit on some of the things, especially in a 10-year time frame. 10 years goes by pretty quick. And
a lot changes in 10 years.
Right. And I think one of the things to understand for a lot of the more far off future space things like space settlement and mining asteroids, there's an economic problem in that resources from space specifically, and the logistics that support them, are incredibly difficult to compete directly against the existing optimized supply chains that exist on the Earth. And so one of the things that from a space economics standpoint, and yes, there are actually people that have PhDs in space economics, there's a saying that we have that resources from space only make sense in space. So there's space for space and there's space for Earth. So when we talk about space for Earth, we're talking about things that are bits. So it's Earth observation and communications. Those make sense.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Right. But if you're talking about actual physical things, like I want to go mine an asteroid, you can't bring it back to the Earth and make a profit at it because the mine that's down here is already highly efficient. It's really hard to overcome the launch costs for getting up there, the delta V to be able to get it back down here, how to get it back down in one piece, that kind of thing. And so the things that we look for are, when do the other applications that need to be in space hit a tipping point where those things that are in space need resources to maintain what they're doing. And right now, with the industry being dominated by Earth observation and communications, they don't need those resources. They just need electricity, and that's it. And they get that from solar panels.
Solar wings, yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that we look at as one of the drivers that needs those resources on an ongoing basis are people. So what we're looking for is, when does the tipping point occur when we have enough people living in space?
Living and working in space
and making money in space and doing everything that humans beings do in space, that there are enough of them that it makes more sense to bring things down from the moon or down from an asteroid or whatever to supply them versus bringing it up from the Earth. That's that tipping point when that occurs. And so we're paying really close attention to the current, what people call space tourism markets, but with the changes that SpaceX brought with the new Crew Dragon, the spacesuits and everything, being in space now actually looks sexy. Whereas previously on a Soyuz, it looked miserable, and it really was.
It was miserable.
It was miserable. You have to wear a diaper, your knees are around your chin, you're cramped for 3 days straight. No, it's not fun. You're starting to see more people decide that they're willing to spend the money to go because they have a personal reason to go. And they're spending about $50 million a person, so it's a lot of money. So what we're looking for is, you're now getting the initial reboot of the space tourism market, that once that price starts coming down a little bit, the market gets larger. And we think that one of the inflection points is roughly around $20 million a person. If you get it down to that point, you go from 10 to 20 people per year to hundreds of people. Because at that point, there's ways to finance that. Depending on where you live, if a reasonable house in San Francisco, you save it up, you sell your house, you can go to space. And that's what we're looking for, is what are those inflection points where when a certain price hits a certain level, that enables those things. And so I would say those kind of futuristic space mining, space habitats. And that's one of the things we're watching right now, which is NASA is getting out of the space station business. The International Space Station will be decommissioned around 2030.
Oh, really?
At the end of the decade.
Okay.
It's getting old. It's way past its lifetime in a lot of cases. And so NASA has a program called the Commercial LEO Destinations Program, where they are incentivizing and working with other companies to build new commercial space stations. One of them is a company that we've invested in, Axiom Space. They've already flown one mission up to ISS with 3 astronauts. They're doing another one this summer. The other was Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' company. There's 2 others, Sierra Space, which Stephen had mentioned a minute ago, and another one called Voyager Space, that's working with the European Space Agency. Those are the destinations that people can go to. We expect those to come online and start providing services at the later part of this decade, starting probably around 2026, 27. When you have that and the ISS going away, you now have these companies trying to build sustainable businesses. And if the launch costs for flying people up there gets down to that $20 million range, that's when you start to see that system where more people are going. The space stations are growing. They're adding habitats. Now they need resources. That's kind of the inflection point that we're still looking at. To say, when we see that occur, then I start actively looking at, resources from the moon. Makes sense from a delta V standpoint, because if you think of the Earth-Moon system, the Earth is at the bottom of the hill and the moon's up at the top of the hill. So if you take stuff up there, you just toss it down the hill. And that's why it's efficient. And so those are some of the trends that we're looking for. Right now, my gut suggests it's going to be right around 2030. The wild card in all of this is Starship. Is the launch capability of that vehicle, the amount of just room it has in that payload fairing, and the amount of mass it contains.
And for context, Starship is the bigger ship work from SpaceX that can transport a lot of people, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because Dragon is the small manned, like maybe 4 people, right?
Yep.
Yeah. How many people can Starship?
I've seen a couple of designs where if you just cram it full of seats, it can take about 100 people.
Wow. Okay.
Right.
It's a massive increase over capacity.
It's the largest
than what
rocket
we have
that's
right
ever been
now.
built. And so,
And we do have to give Elon a lot of credit. He did almost single-handedly transformed commercial space.
Right.
The lowering of launch costs, the reusability. I mean, he was driving all these things.
And I remember reading his biography where he talked about how he was buying like decommissioned Russian rockets.
He was trying to. Yeah. That failed deal actually spurred him to create SpaceX.
Oh, right.
So he wanted to buy decommissioned Russian ICBMs to launch a greenhouse.
Right, the greenhouse,
to Mars. And the Russians played games, and it all fell through. And Elon, instead of giving up,
I can build this myself. What parts do I need?
And that's when the entrepreneur in him kind of kicked in and going, wow, this is a market just waiting to be disrupted, and I can do it.
Right, and I think, he said like he could actually do it cheaper than buy it,
And that's what we're seeing across the board here. So Elon is dramatically lowering launch costs. Everybody's having to follow up and do their own thing to match. But that's trends.
I saw the graph, not to interrupt, where from the 80s to today, it's dropped by 99%, and then it's prognosticated by 2050, it drops another 99%.
Yep. And if it was just that, I don't think most of the cases would still close, but we had a whole bunch of other things that happened at the same time, where you had miniaturization of components. The computer revolution isn't just in your cell phone; it's in everything that goes into space, into your vehicles everywhere. The satellites got smaller, which means mass is everything. When you're launching something to space, the solar panels got better. Everything just started working better. And again, this is decades of tech development, and it just came together for the right time.
Being able to land and reuse rockets was obviously one of those big turning points. What are the next optimizations that are still possible to reduce the cost?
So Starship is the next big one.
Starship is the next big one. But the key thing that Starship is doing that Falcon 9 can't do right now, which is recover the second stage. There is no when Falcon 9 launches, they recover the booster. But there's an additional stage that takes the satellite that it's carrying from that initial non-orbital altitude and actually accelerates it up to the point where it's in orbit. Those fall back into the ocean. They haven't been able to figure out a way to recover those economically. Starship solves that by the entire thing comes back every single time. But it's got the payload fairing. And one of the things that Steve and I have looked at around the industry is we talk to entrepreneurs about, okay, what is your strategy and plan for dealing with Starship? How does it change your business? And the answer that we get time and time again is, I'm not really sure. I can launch my constellation faster. Okay, that's not...
It's not incremental improvement.
It's incremental is all they're thinking about.
Revolutionary change. Not so much.
But you have a revolutionary rocket over here. What are you going to do with it? And so it's almost like somebody has brought in something from the far future, and we're a bunch of monkeys poking at it, and we don't know what to do with it.
That's pretty much it.
Right. And so the phrase that we use is the Starship singularity. Is we know he's going to build it, but we don't know what the space industry looks like on the other side of it.
Got it.
Well, first it's got to get off the pad.
Yes.
So that's what we're all waiting with bated breath to see.
What's the timeline for Starship?
The booster could actually fly tomorrow.
Wow.
Elon actually flew down to Boca Chica yesterday, and so that's what we're looking for. That, at least in my mind, understanding that one of the biggest impacts of large rockets is the acoustics of all those engines firing because when you hear that roar,
just gets crazy when you add this many engines together.
When you hear that roar of a rocket, that's because the exhaust is coming out supersonic.
Yeah.
And when you have that, you're having this continuous sonic boom bouncing in between all these engines inside the engine bell. And that is the biggest risk for that vehicle, is the acoustics of those engines, all 33 of them going off at once.
Why? What would it cause?
Because vibrations. Okay. Because the sound is bouncing off of all these things.
It's really hard to model perfectly.
And it amplifies.
I mean, SpaceX is as good as it gets, but it's hard for anybody to make this
the last time somebody tried to build a rocket with this many engines on it was the Russians during the Apollo era.
Okay.
And they never got a vehicle in orbit. It blew up every single time. And the understanding was either how to get all 33 engines going at once, which is a hard problem, but then how to deal with the acoustics of it. And that's the biggest issues. And so that's what, once I get the idea that when they do the road closures and they know they're about to do it, Stephen, you may have to do all the meetings yourself because I'm going to have to go watch that. But that's the biggest thing because we know that the vehicle on top will work. It's the booster. When that booster works, then they'll probably crash a few.
Yeah.
But at that point, the system will work.
To rotate it off into temporarily something a little bit more philosophical, because I think many different companies have different approaches. So, for example, Blue Origin's whole thesis, as I understand it, is well, Blue Origin, like nothing will be like Earth, so let's move industry to like the moon or other planets, right? Where there's a certain level of Earth romanticism too, and then there's SpaceX probably Elon says this planet too will one day die. We need to become multiplanetary if we want to survive as species. And so I guess the difference is one is like industrial space, one is residential space. And, a lot of times you mentioned climate change earlier, people say like, oh, why are we going to space when we have problems here, right? Where do you see the future of space? Is it that we will use space technologies more as an auxiliary tool to make life here better and like save this planet? Or is it more so that we're finding plan Bs and, colonizing?
There's Jeff Bezos, when he did his high school valedictorian speech, was talked about an astrophysicist named Gerard K. O'Neill. And that's where a lot of this really does originate from. And even when you hear Elon talk, he's talking about the same thing that Jerry O'Neill talked about. He was an astrophysicist at the time, and a lot of people in the space industry were his students. And he asked a very important question of his students to do an evaluation of. Is the surface of a planet the appropriate place to build a technological civilization? And the conclusion that his students came to was no. That if you really do want to build a high energy technological civilization with large numbers of people, you need to do it in space because that's where there's a sufficient resources to do it. You can do it on the surface of a planet, but you will need enough resources and energy that you will end up destroying the planet in the process. And so whether it's Elon going to Mars or Jeff Bezos building what we call O'Neill cylinders or habitats in space with large numbers of people, it's the same general idea, is the future of an expanding, thriving human race is in space because that's the only place that has the resources that allow us to realize all of our ambitions. And if we stay down here, we are naturally constrained by the capabilities of the planet.
Or one day kill the planet, right?
Or
That's
kill the
because
planet
it's one of those two. Essentially,
Right.
you either have to make concessions and say we're gonna fight progress, or essentially, consume all the resources.
Right, and that's one of the things that Jeff Bezos talks about. Is those are your two choices: either an aspirational, expanding, growing idea of what it means to be humanity, but if you're here, it's stagnation.
Yeah.
You can't. You have to limit everything that you do because you're going to eat the earth if you don't.
Right.
And so that's where everybody comes from. And so that's why, whether it's Elon or even pretty much anybody in the industry that's talking about human spaceflight, that's where we're going.
It's fascinating because I knew it was deeply rooted for Bezos because I remember in the early days, like Blue Origin was like a secret project, and like he even said like Amazon was essentially like a means to an end to do Blue Origin, but I didn't know that he talked about it as a valedictorian speech already. I mean, this is like beginning of the life where it's like this is what I'm setting out to do, and I know he thinks long term because he has this. I think he built a millennium clock somewhere like deep in a mountain, which is another like fascinating little side story of Bezos if somebody hasn't heard about that one. Let's get into the more business and the funding side. We talked earlier about how you guys are taking a very much a business approach, like what is actually possible, and like how can they make money today. But also we mentioned earlier how the funding has changed from like public sector to private sector to now there's a venture capital space. How much are governments still involved in the space industry, given that you're saying the ISS is even getting shut down? Like if you had to say it like percentage wise, where's the funding coming from?
Still a lot of government spending going into this. It's just shifting in how it's being spent.
Okay.
So the commercial companies are coming in and providing the same or better service at a cheaper price. and they're adding new technologies and new capabilities into the systems. So I'll take radar satellites for an example. Before 2015, you couldn't even have a commercially licensed U.S. radar satellite company. The laws weren't in place to allow them to do it outside of a military contract. As that industry grows, the government programs shift from government-owned, operated, managed systems to now commercial contracts with outsourced companies who own their own satellites, their own data, their own hardware. Government might have an exclusive license to parts of that data, but they're also paying less for it than if they were operating the system under the traditional budget.
If they could even build it.
If they could even build it, because the innovation that we're seeing now is so much faster than what we had when it was just purely government, because the incentives are there. You know, the next company wants to one-up the one that formed 5 years ago with something better.
Yeah.
And there just wasn't that same kind of motivation and reward that there was under the government system. But yes, government is still a significant player. We're seeing more commercial activity, but it's slower than the government adoption, I would say, for a lot of these services. A lot of these services, except in communication. Communication moves pretty fast.
Everybody gets communications, but especially Earth observation.
Yeah.
There's a challenge right now in. I can give you a picture or a SAR waveform.
But they have to know what to do with it.
Right. And especially you have to be able to then take that data and correlate it and add other data from other sources to it to be able to produce an information product that helps somebody actually solve a problem.
Yeah.
And that's what we're in right now in Earth observation. We're getting a lot of new companies that are finally getting to the point where I've got the data, but I want to solve a problem as opposed to I want to build a satellite. I like building satellites. I want to build a satellite. No, I have somebody that there's a real problem, whether it's, erosion of coastal islands because of, sea level rise, or it's one of the ones right now is detection of tsunamis in the middle of the Pacific. I mean, with the right satellites, you can detect a 1-inch rise in the surface of the ocean. And that's how big a tsunami is when it's in the middle of the ocean. It's only a 1 inch or so increase in the height of the ocean.
Wow.
But when it hits land, then you get a tsunami. And it's those kinds of problems that people are now realizing the data's there.
Yeah.
I can use a satellite system to be able to get the data.
But it's becoming cheaper too.
Right.
And as these prices of the data come down, just like launch costs came down, new business cases open up. People find new ways to use it that they previously couldn't because they couldn't afford the data.
Well, and one of the key aspects of the lowering prices is now it allows people to experiment.
Right.
Previously, if you're going to build a satellite, you had to get somebody, the government, to create $1 billion program.
Correct.
To build it all. Now you've got CubeSats being built by 7th graders in schools and flying them. And so when you have that now you're getting into more of a, from a software engineer standpoint, your build, compile, test cycle is really, really rapid, whereas 20 years ago, it took a decade to build a satellite.
Right. And I'm curious because kind of back to the funding. So since government is still the one funding a lot of this, how does that look like from?
That's changing.
It's
It depends
changing.
on the company and
whether they are doing
the
funding, but it's also contracts. I mean, contracts still matter a lot. It seems like.
But the federal government doesn't actually fund, doesn't act as an investor.
Okay.
So it's really just acting as a customer.
They're buying services that they need.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
The fundamental change, though, is they are actually trying to act commercial.
I see.
So I'm going to really geek out on government procurement for a second to explain the issue. Remember all the legends we've always heard where periodically you get oh my God, the Department of Defense spent $10,000 on a toilet.
Yeah.
And that's because, the toilet itself still only cost $100.
Yeah.
It's all of the procurement officers and the process of ensuring that fraud could never occur. And it always goes back to some of the bad things that happened after World War II. And this is where we ended up with something called Federal Acquisition Rules, what we call FAR. FAR is incredibly difficult to deal with. And it's hugely expensive, and it doubles, triples, even quadruples the price of anything it touches. what happened is NASA had something called Other Transaction Authority built into its charter way back in the 1950s. And that gave NASA the ability to say, we're gonna make an end run around FAR. We can do things that exit that and just do a standard contract. Here's the money, here's the thing, go. What the federal government has finally learned is FAR is useful for things that you already know how to do. But when you're trying to do something new, you cannot do that. And so now what the government is doing is buying products and services from these new companies in a way that doesn't kill the company in the process. Because if you're a startup and you have to deal with FAR, you're dead. You cannot do it. And so that's one of the fundamental changes, is the government is now acting like a sane customer.
I should caveat that Michael lives in Washington, D.C., so he's a bit of a policy wonk.
Sorry.
And he hangs out with staffers and is trying to subtly influence space policy to open things up for the world here.
And I would say that the biggest innovation that allows some of these things to happen is the government stopped being a terrible, terrible customer.
Okay.
It's still ornery and hard to deal with sometimes, but at least the contracts won't kill you.
But how does it look like from a governance perspective? Because like in the 60s, it was a highly political issue. It was like, America versus Russia. I don't know if it's today like America versus China, possibly.
More and more so.
More and more so. And so like, I'm sure that, let's say if you want to be a customer, I mean, well, not I'm sure, I'm guessing, you can tell me if I'm wrong, that they might say, hey, if we're going to work with you, you probably can't work with China.
Absolutely.
Right.
But that's the case in general.
So even though you're not an investor, you're not an owner, they're still giving you rules to play by.
Yeah, but those rules apply to everybody because there's something called International Trafficking and Arms Regulations, ITAR. And so for certain things that are protected technologies, you can't deal with China anyway.
Yeah.
Whether you're dealing with the federal government or not. And most countries around the world, China included, have laws that limit the transfer of sensitive military technologies. And there are a lot of space-related technologies that are what we call dual use. You can use it peacefully, but you can also do bad things with it too.
Right.
And so
it even comes down to us as investors. We have to be very careful where our investors are domiciled and what their citizenship is, and we have to know our investors so that it doesn't bite us down the line.
Even
And
with
so-
OFAC countries and whatnot,
Yes,
Exactly.
So we have to put some good diligence into that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm sure, if there's even just one LP that is, coming from a restricted region, and then you're now investing in a company that, I guess, with security clearances and whatnot, that might become an issue because they probably are able to, give you information. You might have allowed to give them information. So then it's like a trickle-down economy of, sharing information that's not meant to go to certain eyes.
Oftentimes we see the technology before the government does, and we see its development. And we're not seeing the schematics, but we understand what is going on, when it's likely to go to market.
That's exciting. What are some of the most maybe exciting kind of futuristic technologies that maybe the average person doesn't even know exist or that are happening?
Some fun ones and some scary ones and some in between.
I like that.
Reusable satellites is something that I never thought I'd see.
Okay.
But there's companies now that are working to basically land satellites at the end of their life or after they've done the experiment that they wanted to do. They're not burning up in orbit anymore. They're coming down and in some cases doing a soft landing, and you're able to get your experiment out, and that's pretty wild to me.
That's right.
What are you seeing, Michael? That's
well, some of it is the data analytics around Earth observation.
Okay.
That's going to simultaneously be very, very useful, but it could also get creepy.
Okay. In what way?
If you have anything you want to build and keep it private, you probably need to do it in the next year or two. Otherwise, you're going to have something looking down at you.
Even through buildings?
Not through the buildings. Well,
sometimes a little bit through the building.
Okay.
A little bit, yeah.
Time to get a bunker. Secret lab.
But we're getting to the point where it'll soon be ubiquitous coverage of the entire Earth, maybe not the exact pole for a while, but most interesting places on Earth are going to have something looking down at it almost continuously.
There's a concept called you've heard of it, digital twin. But both Amazon and Microsoft are building digital twins of the planet.
Wow.
And so using that data, you can then do analytics
and predictive analytics.
Predictive analytics, not just weather, but, all kinds of, animal migrations and all these other kinds of things. Once you have the data and you can extrapolate from it, there's a lot of really interesting things you can do that for managing our resources that we use on the planet. But, in the wrong hands, it can also get creepy and dangerous. And so I think there's going to be, at some point over the next, 10, 20 years, there's going to be some general governance rules about how you can use some of this data. Yeah. And for example, at least in the US and most countries, there's limits to the resolution you can go down to. And that has dropped down to about 10 centimeters in certain cases. But that's going to be some pushback sometimes. So I think you're going to have this give and take of, okay, what Earth observation data can you use, how you can use it, and I suspect we're going to see some.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the before and after pictures with Umbra, for example, where it's like super crisp.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another trend going on too that I think will disappoint some people, especially when I first started looking at the space industry. Militarization of space was something everybody was trying to avoid. And at this point in time, given everything that's happening and we're seeing the trends, militarization of space is probably inevitable.
For sure.
And so that has changed. The space cadets that I was hanging out with in 2012 would be very disappointed, a lot of them, with how things transpired on that regard. But they might have just been naive in thinking that could be kept out when the world is the world.
Who even owns space? I know there's international rules that all space territory, like planets are like neutral territory, from what I understand. But like I feel like that's not how the world works ultimately.
And less and less, because nations are now dropping out of the Moon Treaty, which was far more restrictive than the Outer Space Treaty. Everybody who's spacefaring is still operating under the outer space theory or outer space treaty that essentially, I guess the bones of it is that a sovereign country cannot own real estate or things in space.
You cannot claim sovereignty over any heavenly body.
Right. And where it gets a little bit gray from a legal standpoint is, does that apply to their country's corporations and private citizens? Because that was not envisioned when they wrote this. They didn't think that companies or individuals would ever have the resources to do the things that they're now on
and
the
it's a
verge
great
of doing.
backdoor for the governments too, to say like, look, we can't do it without starting war, so you go do. We might give you the funding.
You are 100% correct, and that is why I think some of these commercial contracts are coming down the pike in the future. Is because the government doesn't own it, a corporation does.
Yeah.
But the government's a customer.
That's where something called the Artemis Accords, which is something that the U.S. government did starting about 4 years ago now. Yeah. It's maintaining the adherence to the Outer Space Treaty because nobody wants to touch those because it's agreed upon law. Yeah. And it seems to keep people from acting badly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Pandora's box where like you don't want to be the one opening it. Exactly. Maybe skirt around it a little bit, but who knows what happens once one breaks, whether it's the U.S. or China, because then you might actually start having space wars, Right.
And so one of the things that the Artemis Accords kind of does is it takes a kind of a thought from the fact that nobody owns the oceans either. But if you're on a boat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you catch a fish, you get to keep the fish. The fish is now yours. And so if you go to the moon, you cannot claim sovereignty that you own the piece of the moon that you're landing on. But if you do extract some resources from that spot to be able to make water or smelt it into metals or whatever, that when you do that, when you improve it in some way, that's a mining term, then you own the product of what effort you put into it. And so that's where we're currently at, and that seems to be working. It's
kind of a weird sort of libertarian idea of, don't interfere with your neighbor, you control your little spot. I think that's kind of the exclusion zone idea.
Yeah, but then you don't want exclusion zones because then that's just a way of claiming sovereignty.
It's a roundabout way. Yeah.
We could do it. You can do it.
We're going way into policy now.
there are podcasts that do nothing but talk about this.
Yeah.
The problem with that will eventually be, the concept of the tragedy of the commons, where like, if you're allowed to extract, and once it's, valuable enough and everybody starts extracting, it's a race who can extract the fastest,
Well, isn't that kind of one of the exciting parts about space, is that all the rules aren't written yet, and so we're seeing them play out in real time here. We're basically writing the course of history over the next couple of decades for how it's likely to play out for hundreds of years after.
And waxing philosophical for a second, that's the fundamental thing that when I got into this sector, was to quote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, space is big. Space is really big. You have absolutely no idea how really big space is.
Yeah.
There's enough room and enough resources that humanity can exist in space, and people of very different outlooks on life and how to live can exist without coming into conflict with anyone else, because they have all the resources they need and they have all the room they need. Down here, we're limited.
Yeah.
Everything that someone needs, someone else also needs it too, and there's a limited, finite amount of resources. So conflict is naturally going to occur. In space, the resources and the space to live in, that's not the issue. So at least in that sense, space should be a much more peaceful place, because you're not constantly running into your neighbor.
Except cislunar space is probably your most valuable real estate.
It is right now, because that's
I was
where
going
it's
to say
few hundred
resources.
years.
Wars have always been fought over resources. Back when human population was very, very small, when probably human population was smaller than some big cities today, they still fought over the river basin territories, where there was there was stuff growing, where there was very fertile ground,
Right, but this is one of the things that we look at the technologies that are enabling human settlement of space. They're the same technologies we're using down here to be able to utilize the land more efficiently. And so in space, you're making everything out of the raw materials, the basic fundamental elements. We're learning how to create crops and food and everything, not by having to create a farm the way we have, like you would find in the Midwest somewhere.
You print your food. You
print your food from the fundamental elements.
Yeah.
And so, you're starting to get kind of Star Trek-y, but yes, that's where we're going to, is that you can build a civilization anywhere, because everything is under your control that you need to be able to have inputs in that civilization.
Well, better be under your control. It's going to kill you otherwise.
Right. And so that's the kind of, when some people look at some of the things that we invested in, they're like, wait, that's not space. We invested in
the fish one.
Yeah, about half our portfolio you wouldn't immediately recognize as a space company.
Yeah,
but it's all connected in one way or another.
Right.
I know, because I've been vegetarian for 20 years, and I remember talking to Lisa, and I looked over the portfolio back then, and it was finless meats, which were fake fish, and I was like, space investment, but it made sense, because it's something that's viable protein for even in space that they can create in space.
But it needs to taste good.
Right.
And so one of the other ones we invested in was New Age Meats, which was pork products. And, if you're going to go into space, the livestock supply chain is one of the most energy intensive and wasteful things that we do. If we can figure out, if you're going to take that into space, and human beings need protein, and we like our protein to taste good, you're not going to replicate the livestock supply chain in space.
Yeah, so you're not going to import cows to Mars, but maybe you can bring a 3D printer and some
print a steak. Right. And but those are the things that allow us to be able to live both more creatively and more energy efficiently.
Yeah.
And so that's what we learn from space that we then need to bring back to the Earth and make sure that we're not screwing it up down here.
Energy and heat management are major parts of any space portfolio. So we have a carbon nanotube company that is able to more efficiently get heat off of semiconductors. That was designed for satellites that can then be transformed into using for terrestrial applications. We are invested in an apparel company. Now, why in the world are we invested in an apparel company? It's because they are using an aerogel material that was developed by NASA that they've found a unique formulation to coat fibers with that they can make winter wear here on the Earth. And you can make it, instead of that big puffy jacket, thin little layer like that.
Perfect.
And so, we see so many technical advances that first come out of the space sector, and a lot of times they die on the vine. Like nobody's picking them up. There's probably 1,000 technologies out there that NASA developed or one of their partners developed that they did a research paper and then that was it. They moved on.
I remember maybe
some of
from
them,
like some high school researcher, like Velcro, was like a side product invented by NASA,
Actually, no.
Most of the stories, Velcro, Tang, all those are...
Those pre-existed before NASA, both of them.
No? Okay.
Yeah,
then they lied to me.
Hate to burst the bubbles.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, but I guess they invented a lot of other cool stuff. Yes. That's probably way cooler than Velcro.
Well,
so.
they've done some really substantial stuff like fundamental pharmaceutical research that has led to major drugs, major treatments that were first discovered in microgravity. There was a key component that was discovered in microgravity because think about microgravity as the one laboratory variable that no life on Earth has ever experienced before. And so when you put it in there, you get different behaviors, different gene expressions, different things happen when you have a new variable added to an experiment. So we're still in the process of figuring out what that means.
Right, because then now you're almost adding a new control group to seeing what life on Earth is actually like.
Right.
Because you're assuming that that's the fixed variable, but it's not.
Yep. Right.
Yeah, interesting. I've got a couple more questions before we wrap it up. One is, and this we hinted at this earlier, with that kind of the approach to investing, which is kind of bridging futurism and profitability, because it's very easy to talk about, I think when people think space, they mostly think of like rockets and everything. They don't think of like, what do you eat once you're in space? What do you wear when you're in space, and so forth. And so maybe from the angle of an entrepreneur, that wants to work in the space industry, build something in the space industry, how do you even get started if you're not a billionaire? Not everybody can start buying or building rockets.
It's the same thing that you do in any other sector. Is if you, and this is one of the things that we spend a lot of time dealing with. And I'm coming from a recovering software engineer. Technical people, we tend to fall in love with the technology as opposed to the actual problem that it's trying to solve.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest issues we have. That's one of the reasons why there are, the last time I checked, 176 launch companies in the world.
Probably too many.
Yes, way too many.
That's about 170 too many.
Right. But it is because rockets are fun to build.
Yeah.
And somebody comes up with some kind of idea and they think they can do it, but they never focus on the fundamental business of business, which is solving a problem for somebody in a way that they're willing to pay you to do it. And hopefully the amount they pay you is greater than what it costs to be able to do the thing. And that's the fundamental thing that I would tell anybody that's looking at getting into the space sector to do something is solve a problem. Fall in love with your potential customers' problems, not your solution to it.
I think you wrote a paper on this.
I do. If you look on our website, this comes from the lean startup methodology. But there's a market readiness level thing where you test the market, you test it with the customer, and I've got several papers. I did a talk at the Aerospace Corporation event. Where I had a large number of people from NASA and a whole bunch of other companies that had been in the space sector for a long time. And the basic point I said, unless you actually have a customer and a customer that's real, none of this stuff works. And they were like, really? And so,
novel concept.
Right. In the space sector, the whole idea of having a customer that's not the government is so alien that nobody ever thought about having a customer. And so it all does come back to solving a business problem using technology to do it. And space is unique enough. It has unique solutions to these problems. But if you can solve a problem more cost effectively by not doing something in space, do it that way. It's
for now.
But that's the thing about the sector that's been one of our biggest issues is we have a lot of entrepreneurs that are far more enamored of their technology. And so that's a
technology in search of a problem. Yeah, that is a problem for the sector.
I think it's in a lot of industries. Crypto has that problem as well.
Is it? Okay.
I mean, that was my first startup that failed miserably. I had fallen in love with the technology and I never actually talked to a customer until I'd built the thing. And no, I don't need that.
So that's kind of the secret to how to invest for profits in venture capital space is understand the company's customer, and in often cases understand the customer's customer and how that value chain filters back to your investment.
That's something we sort of have a reputation in the industry is whenever Michael comes to talk about something, he's like, it's not just who your customer is. I want to know the chain all the way down. And that was an example I used when I was talking to Aerospace Corporation. It's like if you're in the ag tech business, who do you think the ultimate customer is? Like the farmer? Like no, it's the person who wants a meal that is healthy, fulfilling, reliable, and safe.
Yeah.
If human beings didn't eat food, farmer would do something else. And so in all these things, you have to be able to identify what that value network all the way down is and what value is being derived at each step and what does that mean to you. And that's the hardest thing for technology-oriented entrepreneurs to get is, no, it's not all about you. So, yeah.
That's funny. Let's do a couple of rapid-fire questions.
Sure.
Maybe not so rapid-fire, but like one, we talked about this outside. How can I go to space? Any listener, like if any of the listeners like, I actually want to go to space, I don't have 50 million lying around. What's a way I can make it?
Wait a little bit longer for the price to drop.
Okay.
That's option one.
Yeah. But
Option
even
two?
then, the other option is getting someone else to pay you to do it. And that's one of the things.
Which is the thing most people don't realize already happens.
Right.
Okay.
The people that are currently flying up to the International Space Station doing space tourism, when they get on the space station, they're actually doing things that make money.
Okay.
Some of them are doing research. Some of them are doing media events. Some of them are all kinds of different things. Some of them recently have become profitable because they had derivative rights and on content that they produced. And over time, that content builds up enough residuals that you make money on it. And for example, the Axiom 1 flight that was this past summer, the astronauts that went there, they spent 9 days. They were incredibly busy the entire time. They actually said they were a little bit too busy. They didn't really have time to look out the window. Right. And but
their time was very scripted.
They were being paid to do research by people in their countries. They were doing a lot of outreach to communities back in their home countries, and they were quite busy. And I think it really is because the people that can afford to go right now are inherently entrepreneurs. And so they're looking at how can everything I do create value. And when you look at it that way, you can start figuring out ways, whether it's entertainment or fundamental scientific research or anything else, that you can create it so that you may still have to pay a little bit, but the bulk of the cost, which is currently right now about $50 million, build a business around it.
Yeah.
And that's how you can afford to do it.
Got you. Okay, so I got to find something that I can do in space that makes money. I guess the genetic research you mentioned is some of that, or if you're a great photographer, or
shoot a movie like Tom Cruise is going to
shoot a movie like Tom Cruise, maybe if the podcast grows, and there's like millions of you watching this, maybe then like we can make it, but I think Joe Rogan is closer to that than I am, but eventually. All right, so that's how we can get to space, or just wait. I think, anybody who's got, if you can wait another 20 years, I think it's probably going to look a lot better.
Much, yes.
Space Force.
Yeah.
What about the actual one on the TV show? What's
the
it
TV
take?
show is awful compared to the reality.
Yes.
It's
unwatchable for some of us.
Space Force, a lot of people think Donald Trump came up with it.
Yeah.
No, actually, we've been talking about an equivalent of that going all the way back to the first Bush administration.
Oh, okay.
There are active threats in space.
Okay.
China is actively blocking and screwing around with our space assets in space.
Started as cyber type threats, but now it's getting into the realm of the physical.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually going up and manipulating things.
Well, just physical things getting in the way of other physical things causes chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's needed to be something, because the problem at the time was all this was embedded in the Air Force.
Yep.
And so you had fighter pilots trying to do space stuff, and it just wasn't working. And so there was a long conversation about when is the right time to create a separate branch whose job was to solve this specific problem.
Yeah.
Who thinks like a space general, or somebody who that's their primary. When it was under the Air Force, space kind of always got second fiddle.
Yeah.
It was always in a different mindset. So it really does make sense to split it out into its own separate thing, especially going forward. I mean, this, like I said, was kind of an inevitability. It's just a question of, who was president, what had happened. And
it's going to have entirely different like policies as well, because one is really more international. The other one is really defined by your national rules.
Yeah,
and you have different treaties, different rules of engagement.
To be honest, Space Force is still figuring out their role at this point. They're still very new.
So that does sound like a little bit like the TV show.
But not quite that chaotic.
Well, but it also has to quote somebody in Space Force. I will deal with the alligator that's swimming toward me after I deal with the one that's chewing my foot off.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, they have a lot on their plate right
and
now.
They're standing up an entirely new branch of the military, and that itself is difficult.
Yeah.
And so they'll get to those things, but right now they have active threats they're dealing with, and they'll grow and they'll deal with these other problems later.
Okay. Moon landing happened or didn't happen?
Totally happened.
Totally happened.
Oh yeah.
I don't have any doubt.
Okay. How would you disprove a non-believer?
Show the pictures of the footprints when you go back again here in a couple of years.
And besides that, we don't want to get punched out by Buzz Aldrin. Yeah. So we run into him at conferences once in a while.
You can still throw a punch?
Oh, yes. Don't screw with Buzz.
Okay.
You mentioned that to him, and you're going to get it.
We've had several spacecraft that are in orbit around the moon that are continually mapping and looking at things on and you can see the Apollo landers sitting there. You can see the footprints. You can see the tire tracks. All of it's there.
It's a fun theory, but it came. Go trace the origin of it sometime, and it came out of some crackpot stuff.
How come the footprints and the tire prints, they're still there? Like, I mean...
Because there's
no atmosphere, no erosion.
Oh, no erosion.
Those footprints,
no wind.
As long as you don't go near... Now, this is one of the issues with landing on the moon.
Yes, this is an issue.
Since there is no atmosphere, if you kick up dust from a rocket engine, that dust, nothing will stop it except the gravity of the moon. So right now, depending on the rocket, the dust will actually end up landing on the entire other side of the moon.
Oh, it will just keep rotating and flying around?
It does. Well, some of it will go into orbit.
Yeah.
And so that dust becomes a serious problem. Oh. So, if nobody actually generates a lot of dust on the moon, those footprints will be there for millions of years.
But as soon as we have activity of any extent, they're probably going to be eroded.
I feel like with too much activity in space itself is going to become so messy with all this stuff flying around.
But the moon is incredibly messy already.
Yeah.
The astronauts that went to the moon under Apollo, they really only stayed there maximum. I think the longest one is 3 days.
Okay.
And the dust is so incredibly abrasive that all of their equipment was really starting to break down. It gets into the joints of the space suits, and it's
like miniature razor blades, essentially.
Yes, it is.
On the moon.
When you look at it under a microscope, it's shards of metal and glass, and that just are incredibly sharp.
Because they don't erode. On Earth, you would have the same things, but the environment, the atmosphere, it makes everything more subtle over time, and so it's not such a problem.
So that's one of the reasons why right now NASA is putting a lot of, at least some effort into how do I mitigate this problem? So one of the first things, if you're going to build a moon or land on the moon and do it on any kind of regular basis, the first thing you do is you land and build a landing pad. You take the surface of the moon, the regolith, the dirt, and one of the techniques is you microwave it, and it turns into a solid piece that doesn't have the dust problem. And that's one of the biggest issues that people are afraid of right now.
Yeah, because I'm sure that's not just isolated to the moon. That's going to be with like most...
every planetary body. So that's where you get into the argument between the O'Neillians who want to build just in
free space,
free open space, the people who want to do industrialization on the moon, the Mars candidates. All this, everything has its own problem.
But they're all different. Like the dust problems on Mars are different than the dust problems on the moon.
Different
Mars has an atmosphere.
Yeah.
Venus, you can't even go to the surface on because it's 800 degrees and the pressure is murder. And there's no way we're ever sending people to the surface.
10, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a difficult problem, but it's solvable.
Interesting.
And there is actually an organization called For All Moonkind who is working to preserve those footprints, preserve all the history at each one of those landing sites. And one of their major issues right now is how do we preserve it from the dust from the other human activity that ends up happening on the moon. So, yeah.
Correct.
It's a challenge.
Yeah, not just that. I mean, also like if because he said it even exits the moon, like if it gets into into space, it's not the atmosphere. It goes out into space. You're gonna have more and more things flying around, which then can get in the way of rockets and machines. Yeah.
Yeah, but that stuff's already there.
Yeah.
Space is dirty. It already is dirty.
Yeah, but imagine like if you 100x the activity out there, it's gonna get
Sure.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about it is the actual solar wind cleans a lot of that stuff out.
Right.
Yeah. That's true. That's good. Aliens.
I hope not.
Insufficient evidence.
Insufficient evidence? You think we're the only species traveling around here?
There's no evidence.
Okay.
So either way. So
I thought that
you can't answer the question.
Didn't the Department of Defense say that they spotted UFOs? I think didn't they open the files like?
Well, they did, but UFOs doesn't equal aliens, though.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, they changed the acronym too.
Well, yeah,
it's called now. But
my theory on this is that there's probably intelligent life somewhere out there in the universe, but we may never find it because of the expansion of the universe, the way the physics works. Everything's getting further away, is what the current theory looks like, and our visible range and our ability to travel under the speed of light is finite, essentially.
And also because of the using, basically radio frequencies, electromagnetic waves, it's a cube law distribution.
Yeah.
So as it dissipates out, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker so fast that the ability to communicate, even if you saw some evidence. I mean, right now, there's some astronomers that are looking at evidences of technological civilization, looking at the spectra of certain stars to see if there are elements that should not appear there, and that may be an indicator of something that may or may not have occurred.
Well, I totally expect that we'll find life out in the universe. I don't know about intelligent life. That's the big question.
So maybe
mark.
some bacteria.
Well, I think the components of life are just too ubiquitous to think that they're not going to be somewhere. And I'm still holding hope that we might find them in our own solar system if you get out to Jupiter or Saturn.
That's an
from
entirely different set of
I was going to say from like the pure, I guess the travel math. Is it even possible for us to leave our solar system and return?
That's hard.
That's another
You might.
We're looking at technologies that could do it, but man, is that hard.
You may leave, but you won't be coming back.
Right?
Oh, you won't? No, you won't.
Yeah.
Right now, let's
So
just
can't tell the story.
let's get to Mars and back within a few weeks instead of a few months.
Right.
That's our first goal.
One of the things I think.
Well, that doesn't sound that bad. A few weeks or a few months. I was just thinking like Interstellar, where like you come back as like a 70-year-old man.
70,000 years to get to the next star system.
That's time dilation is one thing, but what was the?
Traveling.
One of the things about going that speed to make it easy enough to get somewhere else. When you are going that fast, every little speck of dust becomes a bullet.
That's the problem that we see that isn't in sci-fi.
Right.
At least not in most sci-fi. I think Passengers might have
They just
mentioned that.
put to the warp speed and like.
That was thank you. That was the one of the Passengers.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the design of that spacecraft in Passengers, there's a shield.
Yeah.
Because it was constantly running into things, and you have to have something like that.
Like Michael said, space is dirty, and the tiniest little speck, depending upon the speed you're going, can.
We know this from hurricanes in Florida, where like sometimes there might be a fucking banana flying in to kill somebody. Seems harmless, but
now
there might
accelerate
be a
that banana
limit.
at 20% the speed of light.
Yeah. Oh God.
So speed of light is kind of the barrier speed limit that we think in physics you can't get beyond. But there might actually be a practical speed limit in there based on literally hitting things. But then again, we're seeing companies developing technology literally like Star Trek shields, where they have an EM type device. It's really weak right now. Don't get your hopes up anytime soon. But it's on that path, so maybe we'll figure it out someday.
There was a group called the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop, and it was I've been to a few of them and know a bunch of the people in it, and they're thinking about how do you get to the next star, and it's generation ships, and one of the questions was, if it takes 10,000 years to get somewhere, how do you maintain civilization on a spaceship that's a generation? All these kind of really hard problems. I'll settle for the solar system right now.
Yeah, to be clear, we're not investing in generation ships.
No.
No.
That's fascinating, guys. I really enjoyed today's session. What's the best way for somebody to like learn more about space? Are there any books that you say like, hey, this is a great primer, or resources?
What's the best one for that? The High Frontier got a lot of people.
It did,
into
but
the
it's
industry.
really dated these days. And
Yeah,
it's
that's
hard to
true.
read.
That's true.
Actually, but there is a documentary of Gerard K. O'Neill's life on Apple TV. That's a good introduction to some of the fundamental philosophies that drive a lot of people in the sector. Honestly, one of the best places to keep track of what's going on in the sector and learn what's doing is Twitter, because a lot of people are on there. You get the feeds from ULA and SpaceX and everything like that.
And dedicated YouTube channels is how you get the
Everyday
current
Astronaut.
events. Everyday Astronaut, Marcus House. These guys all do great. I think Marcus does a weekly update that is really, telling you everything you need to know that happened in that last week in space.
Yep. The guy that bought one of the first Starship flights to do the travel around the moon, Tim, Everyday Astronaut, is one of the ones that got picked. And so he's going on that flight. And we don't know exactly when that flight's going to happen. And so, he does a really good job.
Literally over the moon.
Yeah. He does a really good job of taking something complex.
Yep. Making it simple.
Tim Dodd.
Not making it simple. You still understand
Tim Dodd,
it.
isn't it?
Yeah, Tim Dodd.
There we go. Okay.
He doesn't make it so that you don't understand it. He helps you understand it in its complexity.
Ah, okay.
So you really do start learning about how this stuff works, as opposed to just getting the headline.
Without just dumbing it down, right?
Right.
Like pulling the piece apart and then putting it back together.
Yep.
Love that. Awesome. So there's a lot of, it's funny because in crypto, same thing. We've got crypto Twitter, that's a great place to learn from. Sounds like there's space Twitter. So
there is. It's called Spitter.
Spitter. That's a great acronym. So if you want to learn more about space, go to Spitter.
Go to Spitter.
And ULA, SpaceX, the Everyday Astronaut, a lot of great resources. Well.
Yep. Or talk to us. We're happy to have these discussions with anybody who wants to learn. So
glad to come back and do another podcast.
Yeah, 100%. What's the best way to reach you guys? You're also on Twitter, Twitter handles?
Barely.
First initial, last name for me. So M Mealing, that's my Twitter handle.
Boom.
Just go to our website, starbridgevc.com. And just ping me on Twitter. I'm always there, always happy to answer questions and help people out. And especially if there's an entrepreneur out there who's thinking about getting into the sector, wants to know how to not go through some of the pain that some of us did in the early days.
Yep.
Learn from our mistakes.
Don't
great.
do the dumb crap that we did.
Amazing. How about you, Stephen? You in Twitter?
Barely. I'm Starbridge Steve, I believe,
Starbridge Steve.
on Twitter, but I never comment. I just listen into the discussions.
Yeah.
But
it's the fly on the wall.
If somebody reaches out, sure.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, Michael, thank you so much for the time. Really enjoyed, and look forward to seeing where space takes us.
Yes,
absolutely.
It's an adventure.
To that.
Yep.
To the moon.
To the moon. Bye.